Once again, I'm Kathryn Kolbert with the Napa Bookmine, and I'm pleased to be with you tonight to hear legal titans Kathryn Kolbert and Julie F.K., who will be in conversation with Dr. Christine Henberg, discussing their new book, Controlling Women, What We Must Do Now to Save Reproductive Freedom. This very timely book, released this summer. I've got somebody that... Thank you. If you're not on mute, could you please mute yourself? Thank you, and I'll continue. This very timely book released this summer shared stories of one of the most divisive issues in American politics through behind-the-scenes personal narratives of stunning losses, hard-earned victories, and moving accounts of women and healthcare providers at the heart of nearly 5 decades of legal battles. Here's more about the 2 women behind this essential read. Kathryn Kolbert has a long and distinguished career advancing women's rights. In 1992, she made her second appearance before the US Supreme Court, arguing Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the landmark case that has been widely credited with saving Roe v. Wade. A co-founder of the Center for Reproductive Rights and the Athena Film Festival, she also created NPR's Justice Talking and the Athena Center for Leadership at Barnard College. Julie F.K., forgive me for reversing that, began her legal career at the Center for Reproductive Rights and has spent the ensuing decades developing innovative legal and policy initiatives to advance gender equality and religious freedom in the US and internationally. And she helped lay the groundwork for the legalization of abortion in Ireland through the first direct challenge to the country's absolute ban before the European Court of Human Rights, and has fought for legal reforms to protect the parenting rights of people leaving ultra-religious communities. And we're so pleased tonight to have Dr. Christine Henberg moderate our conversation. She is a local physician specializing in women's reproductive health and family planning. Her book, Boundless, An Abortion Doctor Becomes a Mother, is forthcoming in 2022. Thank you all so much for being here. And please take it away.
I'm done. Hi.
Hi, Julie. Hi.
Yeah, can I call you back?
Hi, how are you?
Wait, Lonnie, can you please mute? Hang on a second. And Christine, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. I think we have everyone who's supposed to be talking.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Karen. And Kitty and Julie, welcome to Napa.
Thank you.
Wish you could be here in person. We're really glad that you can be here with us like this. So I just want to begin by acknowledging what a somber and critical time this is for women's reproductive freedom, and especially, I imagine, for both of you, as we are seeing exactly what you predict in this book starting to happening before our eyes, the unraveling of an outright reversal, we imagine potentially soon, of Roe and Casey. Last month, the Supreme Court looked the other way after Texas passed SB 8, and now will reconvene, I believe, this week and prepare to hear Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health, a direct challenge to Roe versus Wade. So I hope we can talk some about the specifics of those 2 cases as they fit into the framework of this book this evening. And I just want to say that, I was talking to a neighbor this weekend after our local rally for reproductive justice here in Napa. She's about 30 years older than I am. And she was talking about the pain of watching this country go back in time to the unraveling of the rights established in Roe and Casey. And as someone who was born after Roe, and even someone who's really close to the abortion rights movement in my work, I admitted to her, and I'll admit now, that that pain of this loss and the awareness of it really has only begun to dawn on me in the last 5 years. Before that, Roe was something that I took for granted. So I'll admit that. I want to start there. Kitty, can you begin by telling us what the audience should know about how Roe v. Wade established abortion rights and how they were later preserved in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which was the landmark case that you argued before the Supreme Court.
Well, thanks, Christine. It's so thrilled to be here, and thanks so much to all of you for joining us tonight. I am on the East Coast and actually in a hotel conference room, so please excuse the nautical theme that's in my background. But let me start by saying what Roe did was it established the constitutional right to choose abortion and to make decisions about one's pregnancy. And it did that by establishing the highest level of constitutional review. In lawyer speak, it means it was very, very difficult to pass a restriction on abortion. But many years later, in 1992, in the case that I argued, we actually thought that there were 5 votes on the court to overrule Roe. And I say to people all the time, arguing before the Supreme Court is a lot like Sesame Street. You need to learn to count. And the only number that matters is 5. If there are 5 votes on the court, no matter how good your legal argument is, you will lose if they are determined to rule in one direction, in this case, against us. And in '92, we thought we were going to lose. It was a challenge to a Pennsylvania law that had a number of restrictions. And right after your oral argument, the justices make a decision. And in my case, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the court ruled 5-4 that Roe was no longer to be the law. But at the last minute, Justice Kennedy switched his vote. And we talk about how this happened in the book. But what it meant is the court adopted a new standard, not the highest level of constitutional protection that we found in Roe, but what we think of as the undue burden test, which is kind of a middle level. The states can pass some restrictions, but as a general rule, legal abortion up until viability had to be preserved. That's why we say Casey preserved Roe. I think the important part is that in the intervening years, as a result of a lot of restrictions passed by state legislatures that were considered to be okay under the undue burden test, the most vulnerable women of little economic means, as low-income women who are disproportionately women of color, women who live in rural areas, and young women and women with disabilities were increasingly, in many, many states, unable to obtain abortion services. That's not true in California, where you live, which is one of the better states. But more and more, women have had increasingly difficult time having access to abortion. So that's where we are today. And I'm going to talk more as we go along. But I would generally say we are at the most perilous point we've ever been about the preservation of Roe. Why? Because there are currently 5, maybe even 6 votes on this increasingly ultra-conservative court that is willing to reverse both Roe and Casey and send the question back to the states to allow each state to determine whether abortion should be legal within their boundaries.
Okay, and I want to get back to those threats in a moment. Would you read an excerpt from the book about your arguing before the Supreme Court?
I'd be happy to. Okay, so let me start here. With their lifetime appointments, Supreme Court justices are supposed to be impervious to public opinion and above the fray of political debate. As the sole unelected branch of the federal government, the court is always sensitive about maintaining its legitimacy with the public and not being seen as ideologues. Yet while the justices may have every intention of ignoring the dynamics of public opinion on controversial issues, it is unlikely that they can remain completely unaware of public sentiment. With this in mind, grassroots abortion rights activists took the lead on rallying public support while the Supreme Court considered the case, that is Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The National Organization for Women organized a March for Women's Lives in support of abortion rights on the first Sunday in April, a few weeks before the argument. These were the days of landline telephones and shiny paper fax machines. Because the internet was not yet widely used and mobile phones were large, clunky, and rare, the organizing effort was more difficult than in today's connected climate, but now succeeded beyond all expectations. At least 500,000 people marched from the White House to the mall near the Capitol. The crowd, perhaps at that time the largest ever to march on Washington, was estimated by the police at 500,000 and by the organizers at 700,000. Joanne and I, Joanne is my wife, were in DC that day with our children and took turns holding Sam's hand or pushing Kate along in her stroller as we marched. The mall was filled with people from across the nation, sporting colorful signs and spirited posters in what felt more like a parade or celebration than a serious or angry political protest. A few of the most rabid anti-abortion activists with their bullhorns and grotesque pictures of bloody fetuses lined the parade route, but they were far outnumbered and ignored. That afternoon, I climbed onto the large stage at one end of the mall to speak. While I have little memory of what I said, I can still remember that I was both extremely nervous and excited about the huge crowd. There were people as far as I could see, and perhaps, for the first time, I let myself feel the enormity of what I was trying to do and how many Americans cared deeply about the rights at stake.
Thanks. Julie, I want to then jump back to the threats Kitty was just starting to talk about in the US and to your experience in Ireland, which is also a big and important part of the book. Maybe you could begin by reading a segment from that section and then telling us about how abortion went from a complete ban in Ireland to full legalization by using the more human rights approach.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's great to be here in virtual Napa and to see everybody tonight. So thank you for that. This is from chapter 10 of Controlling Women. The chapter is called Meanwhile Across the Pond, a Human Rights Approach to Abortion. In July 2009, 4 years after I'd filed a challenge to Ireland's ban on abortion before the European Court of Human Rights, the call finally came. We had been granted a hearing of the case in front of the Grand Chamber, the highest level of the court. I was thrilled and panicked. The fact that the case was heading straight to the Grand Chamber boded well, but I was pregnant with my second child. An oral argument before the court had been scheduled for 6 weeks before I was due to give birth. Time to find a maternity business suit and head to Strasbourg, France. For the morning of the argument, the court has a collegial tradition where the attorneys meet together with the president of the court in his chambers before argument begins. On the elevator ride up, my co-counsel spoke about the weather with the Irish Attorney General, our opposition, while I extolled the virtues of Strasbourg crepes to fill the awkward silence. Nobody mentioned my pregnancy, the elephant in the elevator. Back downstairs, oral argument went by in a blur. With 17 judges, I was uncertain where to look and slowly rotated my head like an owl. After argument, I stepped out onto the court's plaza where the crisp December air alleviated my total fatigue. My colleagues from the Irish Family Planning Association and I took questions from hordes of reporters who asked, how does Ireland's abortion ban violate women's human rights? Bam, our human rights framing had become the new norm. Years later, I would hear an anti-abortion activist on Midwest Radio Shannon rant about the human rights of the unborn. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Thanks. So can you tell us more about the human rights approach and how that was such a game changer in Ireland?
Yeah, I think it was a sort of a long-term plan. Certainly, Ireland's ban on abortion had been written into their constitution in 1983, and it was in part a reaction to Roe v. Wade and a fear among conservative politicians and the Catholic Church that similarly there would be liberalization of abortion law in Ireland. So there was a referendum held that put a provision in the Constitution that equated the life of the unborn with that of the mother. There wasn't much clarity on what that meant as far as protecting women's lives or health, but it was clear that there was no abortion permitted within Ireland. The result was what became called the Irish solution to an Irish problem, in that women would travel from Ireland to England, Spain, Amsterdam, other places to get abortion services, somewhat similar to women traveling in the US before Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, when women could travel to either states where abortion was legalized by the mid 70s or before Roe by the early 70s. And so I was living in Ireland, and I had come from working at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and sort of took an American model of litigation and discovered the European Court of Human Rights, which is a court that exists entirely to enforce the European Convention on Human Rights, which provides human rights language and doctrine and case law to 45 countries throughout Europe. And working very closely with the Irish Family Planning Association and a number of activists, we identified a number of women who had had abortions outside of Ireland, who had taken the Irish journey and traveled abroad, and for a variety of reasons were in need of abortion services, and brought the case before the European Court. And because the European Court of Human Rights takes so long, they have a lot on their docket, and it's just a slow process. In the meantime, we really talked a lot about the human rights framework and how abortion isn't about a religious debate. It's not philosophical about when life begins, but it's really about women's human rights and making the decision about when and whether to have children and with whom, and having support for childbearing as well as for the decision to have an abortion, and that these are really fundamental human rights. And that was really gave us an opportunity to redefine the debate. I think the excerpt kind of talks jokingly about forcing the press to ask that question, but it really let people and advocates be on the front foot. We did win on behalf of one of our clients who had been denied access to a life-saving abortion, had had to travel abroad for that. And the court required the government to implement legislation that would allow for abortion in life-saving circumstances. Unfortunately, the government dragged its feet so long that in the meantime, there was a tragic case of a woman, Savita Halapanavar, who had complications from a pregnancy that went untreated. She was in the hospital in Galway, and the doctors would not perform a termination of pregnancy because they could still determine a fetal heartbeat, and they didn't want to violate the constitutional prohibition. So that led to some, mass demonstrations in the streets. It's sort of the kind that Kitty talked about happening in this country, to just, international attention being focused on the law, and eventually enough political pressure to have a referendum that would legalize abortion. So in a fairly short time span, we saw a ban on abortion, a lot of activism, a human rights framework, a lot more activism, and ultimately abortion is now fully legal in Ireland and is paid for by the government in all circumstances. I mean, it's paid in all circumstances. There are limitations on the legalization. So I think that's something, as we talk about different tactics that can help liberalize abortion in this country, Kitty and I look at a lot of different models, both of activism within the US and abroad, that have been very effective in asserting a much more proactive human rights model.
Yeah, that's so, and the stories in that part of the book about the women that you guys argued for, the cases that you took up, and the things those women went through were so moving, and heartbreaking. And speaking of, redefining the terms of the debate, one thing you point out in the book is how, Kitty, maybe I'll ask you this, or either of you, is fair game, but how the Supreme Court in Roe and then in Casey prioritized the men of medicine rather than the women making decisions about their lives. So that was a big aha moment for me, because I think as a doctor, I feel pleased at the idea that the law would acknowledge, my trusted or privileged role as an advocate for my patients and their decisions. But as a woman, of course, one of the things the book helped me realize was how problematic those laws are, especially they were written at a time when they were thinking of men, doctors, acting as buffers against women's irrational or impulsive decisions, and that we can see how we need something much, much better, something that places the woman, at the center of the protections of the law. So what I want to ask is, what might some laws look like that do that differently, placing women at the center?
So Christine, let me just go back a second, because your question really goes to what do we do next? And ultimately, I can't fault Justice Blackmun for basing Roe on the right to privacy, because he was general counsel to the Mayo Clinic. He trusted doctors. It was a male court, but he got 7 votes to uphold the right of privacy, to include the right to make decisions about one's pregnancy. So I don't fault him for doing that. Yes, there is a better argument, in my view, which is equality and women's equality being important. But we are first and foremost now about to lose not even the heightened protection of Roe, but that middle level of protection as well. And what does that mean? That means if the question of abortion goes back to the states, in our view, we're likely to see at least 27 states that are currently controlled by Republican legislators and Republican governors. 27 states ban abortion in some form. Now that may mean as early as, all abortion. It may mean as early as 5 or 6 weeks. It doesn't really matter. The state will be banning abortion and effectively eliminating the right for most women in that state, even with more, with bans that aren't quite as inclusive. But let's not fall for the notion that this will just be okay and everything will be fine. 27 states are likely to ban abortion. And that means we need to look to states like California and the other 17 that are controlled by Democrats and who are pro-choice to provide resources for the women who cannot obtain services in the bulk of the nation. And this is the most important question, we need to build, and we'll talk a lot in the book, a political power to win back the rights that we are losing. And yes, you're right, we can come up with theories that are better than the initial theory in Roe, but we don't have the 5 votes, okay? We don't have the court. And however great our arguments are useless unless you have the power to have them implemented. So in my view, the most important thing all of us can do is to help the women in the states where abortion is banned by changing the political scenarios in those states. In states like California, providing resources for women who need services. They can come to your state and obtain services, and being a model for the good states, like you have often done, and begin to broaden access to a whole range of reproductive health services, because as we say in the book, this is about controlling women. This isn't about religion. This isn't about protection of fetal life. This is about controlling women. And the only way we can stop that is to build the political power to make sure that they don't have the ability to control our most intimate decisions.
I mean, California really is a gold star state in this issue in some ways, but there's a lot more that can be done, both as a model of progress and an example for other states, and because there's still such an incredible need for access to abortion services, and there's such a real inequality in our healthcare system, and the racial inequity both in access to healthcare generally, in maternal mortality and infant mortality. Those are all part of the spectrum of reproductive freedom and the rights that we need. And so I think we talk in the book a lot about California's initiative where the universities are providing medication abortion. And medication abortion is a fabulous new development in that it's in the first 10 plus weeks of pregnancy, you can take a series of pills and have a safe abortion. And in California, the university healthcare services are now providing medication abortion. That's something that we would love other states to replicate. And we also think, it's Kitty and I feel like if a state's doing a lot, great, they can do more. So I think some of the things that we think about for California are these, what about at the so-called doc in a box, or the quick care clinics that have been so vital during COVID, that if they could provide abortion services, either medication or early surgical, how much would that expand options for women, particularly low-income women who don't have access to paid time off and things are restricted hours or need greater access to childcare in order to go to the doctor. So we really like to think creatively. It's exciting to talk to people in a blue state because of that. It's, your options are more limited in other states, and certainly women are going to be traveling. Hopefully we can use telemedicine more, depending on some of the restrictions from state to state, but there's really a lot that can be done. And certainly having mid-level providers be able to offer abortion services where it's feasible and early on and things, all those kinds of ideas that California has been a leader and can be even more of a leader.
Yeah, I mean, all those thoughts are exciting to me, and I hope to the audience too. And I hope there's going to be more questions about that, on our state level. How we can be thinking about helping to make change both in this state and helping women around the country. And I don't know if I guess if I think you've touched on this already, but I am curious to know a little bit more about how you think the abortion landscape will look different when, as you said, in about half of states or a little bit more, abortions effectively banned, as opposed to pre-Roe, when effectively all of this, that abortion was not happening in all but a very few states, and what that might look like for nationwide, the landscape and the women in those states.
Sure, Christina, in the days before Roe, and I'm 69, so I remember a lot of that. I lived in Detroit, and I remember the big billboards that said abortion, legal abortion in Canada, but you couldn't get it in the States, but you could go across the river. The reality was, even in the days before Roe, when abortion was banned in most states, that didn't eliminate all abortions. It just drove them underground, and it made it more difficult for the people with the least resources. So again, that same litany of people: poor women who are disproportionately women of color, women in rural areas, women who are disabled, women who don't have access to help in their communities or who are isolated, young women. Those were the women who were forced to carry their pregnancy to term, or who sought back alley abortions from the worst practitioners. The good news is that since the days of Roe and today, and it's a proportional good news, but the good news is there is today medication abortion, and so women who in the pre-Roe days had to seek back alley care from illegal practitioners and have a surgical procedure, today can take pills, and that, I think, is what is most likely to happen. The issue will be, how do women get the pills? Where can they find appropriate information? Do they have to go to a legal state to get the pills? Or can they get them online or in the mail or through what I think of as gray or black market activities? I think women will be very creative and will find ways to obtain medication abortion. But again, rich white women are not our problem. Yeah. They got abortions before Roe. They'll get abortions illegally after states ban them, but a whole range of other women will be much more impacted. And again, I think the other problem is we're likely to see selected prosecutions, particularly against women of color who try to obtain gray or black market abortion pills. Instead of everybody else who are getting that medication.
And One thing to say, I mean, the writing is on the wall with the Supreme Court, whether it happens in one decision or two, we're going to be having decreased access to abortion rights. But I think one of the points that Kitty and I really want to make, and we make in the book, is that it ain't so great right now for a lot of women. So, if you look at Mississippi has one abortion provider left. The 80% of the counties in the US don't have any abortion providers, and access to abortion in the second trimester is really difficult. And it's, there are financial hurdles, all sorts of hurdles that fall very unfairly on marginalized women. And Christine, you said earlier, that people took it for granted. I mean, I think I had just graduated from nursery school when Roe v. Wade was put into effect. And I don't know that it's taking it for granted as much as we've also been hoodwinked into thinking everything's okay. And so when people start to know and to listen and to hear more about what the current state of abortion providing is in this country, we realize that, it ain't so great. There's too many women who are completely cut off from access to abortion. And so it's good that we're having these conversations now. I mean, a lot of people have been reaching out to Kitty and me and be like, oh my goodness, your book is so timely. And yes, but it's been timely for a while. And so, we do see what's happening now as a rallying cry more than a wake up cry. And I think that the nice thing is that these same sort of younger people who grew up not necessarily taking it for granted, but understanding that this is a fundamental human right, and it's one that they don't think is okay to start messing with. Some of the greatest, the signs and the energy that were coming at some of these marches a lot were from younger women and a lot from older women. I saw a great sign that said, "Shit, are we really doing this again?" From some, grandmothers for choice. And I saw a lot of younger women with like some super creative signs, some of which I felt like I had to shield from my daughter's eyes because she's 11. But there's a great energy out there now. And I think, part of what Kitty and I really want to do is have people know what's been going on in the legal end, because so much of this has happened in courtrooms and it shouldn't be inaccessible to everybody. It's, the more we understand, the more we know and can, really kick and scream when Texas passes a law like a heartbeat ban. That's crazy and went unnoticed for months until it was implemented.
Okay. Right, Christine, I think the other point here, and I think this is really important, is that in the intervening years since Roe, since 1973, people on our side of the issue have been committed to the same old mantra of save Roe, save Roe, save Roe. Well, that ain't gonna work anymore. Mm-hmm. We gotta stop knocking our heads against the marble walls. We've got to begin new strategies. And those new strategies are about building political power. And you do that by hard work. Those who are opposed to us know how to do this. They've been at it for 40 years, but it is relatively new. And so all of the people on this call can help. You can be working for state legislative candidates in blue states or purple states or red states. You can be writing postcards. You could be making phone calls. You could be doing canvassing, because we need committed politicians who care about this issue and are willing to be champions for us and change the status quo.
Yeah, good. I feel really inspired right now to see if there are questions in the audience, or at least to prep the audience that I know that Kitty and Julie really want your questions. I really want you guys to touch on the constitutional amendment for gender equity that you spent some time suggesting and discussing in the book. But that may come up in the Q&A. I want to see if anyone is already eagerly raising their hand or putting anything in the chat. Please unmute yourself if you're burning to ask a question. Otherwise, we can talk about the constitutional amendment for a second and come back to questions.
Sure. This is the constitutional amendment that Kitty and I talk about in the book, is one of those longer term, long range plans where realists and dreamers all in one. And, the anti-abortion movement had a very long plan that's now 50 years into implementation. We're hoping this is fewer than 50 years, but what we're proposing is kind of a supercharged equal rights amendment. It's one that would use a human rights infused model of calling for gender equity, acknowledging the intersection of race and gender in women's access to healthcare, as well as to all aspects of full participation in life. And with the reality that we have the Supreme Court, that best case scenario is going to continue with privacy rights, worst case scenario is much more likely, as we've discussed. So how can we really modernize the Constitution to recognize women's place in the country, women's equity and equality? So we don't write the language out specifically word by word. We quote a lot of good examples, and there's a lot worldwide. Everything from Vermont has a constitutional amendment that they're looking at that would have gender equity. South Africa has a great clause in their constitution, but we're really calling on activists and lawyers and others to come together and start looking at how can we get to where we want to go? What's the big goal here? And throughout the book, we talk about different solutions and different kinds of activism. And we don't have a one size fits all approach. We realize that people have different interests and different communities, different approaches to things. And we really try to get everybody to find something that interests you. Learn a little bit more about the issue if you don't know as much as you'd like already, and bring along a friend to do the same, and really find places to engage. So sometimes the gender equity amendment piece seems wonky and overwhelming, but really what it is a long-term plan to get the Constitution that we want and that we need.
Great, I love that. I think I see a question from an audience member. I can either read it or I'll let that audience member unmute herself and ask. It's a question about legal obstacles to using the abortion pill.
Okay. I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can, yeah.
My question is, what are the legal obstacles that are in place now to allowing women to use the abortion pill? Does each state have the authority to rule on this? Or can it be done online without state interference?
Well, as long as, at least until the court rules differently, Planned Parenthood versus Casey treats medication abortion the same as surgical abortion, and it is legal up until, in medication abortion, it's until 10 weeks of pregnancy, just because that's what the medicine is, but would allow abortion more generally up until the point of viability, and every state has the right to place some restrictions, but not undue ones. Now, what we think is going to happen in what's already happened in Texas as a result of the Texas case, and I'm going to come back to Texas in a second, and when the court reviews the Mississippi case in December, we're likely to see them opening it up and saying states can do anything they want, including ban all abortions, and that would mean medication abortion as well. So in states like California, abortion would still be permitted and medication abortion would be available. And I assure you, will be the home of many women from other states trying to obtain medication services. I think at this point, we should just think about the two types of abortions the same way, and whatever restrictions apply to one are likely to apply to others. Let me return to Texas for a second, because as we saw earlier this summer, in the Texas law, which bans abortion at a point of the fetal heartbeat, which they interpret as about 5 weeks of pregnancy, was enacted. It had a unique provision that allowed enforcement to any person who wanted to sue for civil damages against anyone both providing abortions or helping providers. So, the Lyft driver. And those lawsuits resulted in a $10,000, what are called a bounty or liquidated damages in that litigation. The Supreme Court, remember the number 5. 5 justices of the Supreme Court refused to enjoin the Texas law. They said, let it go into effect. Then we'll see what happens. And actually tonight, just before we got on this call, a district court in Texas has preliminarily enjoined the statute, at least for the time being. Julie and I both think that that is not likely to last for a significant period of time. The Fifth Circuit, which is the most conservative appeals court in the country, will hear the case relatively soon. It could be as early as tomorrow. It could be, a month or 2 down the road. But it is our judgment that the Fifth Circuit will likely reverse the district court and again allow the law to go into effect. Here's the bottom line on all of this. The law is a fickle friend, okay? The courts are not our friend in any shape or form. So let's not be distracted when we win a round like we did tonight. Let's not be distracted from the more important goal of saying the courts are not going to save us. We've got to build the political power we need to make sure legislators don't pass these horrific types of law. And in my view, some of the 27 states will try to adopt laws just like Texas, but others will just ban all abortion, and that frankly is just as effective as the Texas law, even though not quite so dramatic.
And I mean, a positive note, that Texas law was enjoined or was frozen from continued implementation because the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, really stepped up and stepped in. I mean, we lost a lot under the Trump administration, specifically in reproductive freedoms. But the Biden administration could remove some of the restrictions on medication abortion that the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, has kept in place for too long now, some medically unnecessary restrictions on where you can access the pills. And moreover, the House passed the Women's Health Protection Act recently. So, it's hard to get excited about the Senate because they are, very limited to say the least. But I think that those kinds of steps forward to really ask for more, not just defense, but really playing an aggressive game, demanding our rights at the state and federal level. And it shows.
So here's where Julie and I disagree on this, which is I know that the Justice Department is trying to make a great political statement, but let's remember that the fight is not going to be in the federal courts. We don't have the Supreme Court of the United States. And so in my view, while it was politically a good thing for them to do, I mean, obviously it helps the administration to show that they are with us on this issue. It's not a long-term effective strategy. And I think it's a bit of a red herring. It diverts us from remembering that the courts are not our friend and we need to do and build political power in other ways, however magnanimous the Justice Department's effort was.
I will take my cake and eat it too. I want it all. So, and one other thing for California that we were thinking about earlier tonight is there are states like New York has government funding in New York City to support women who are traveling, not just with access to abortion services, but to provide funding that can help with food, lodging, childcare, those kinds of things, as well as obviously there are a lot of really strong private philanthropic organizations that are working to help with travel. So I think, yes, self-help, government help. Well, I think there's many different directions that we need to be focusing on right now.
Yeah, and I just want to, speaking back to the question of medication abortion crossing state lines, I think it's the word that's so important. Of course, it's also changed since Roe. Besides medication abortion, is also the internet, but just reminding about restrictions, that it's not as simple as, oh, I'll just order this from a pharmacy or a doctor in California. Since I'm in Texas, there's restrictions on what providers can prescribe across state lines, and likely, we're seeing women coming into California already from Texas. where the expectation is that they need to complete their even if they're having a medication abortion, they need to take the pills, complete the abortion here in California. Also, that if they then return home to Texas and have a complication, which is rare, but that would be not something that could be easily managed there. So it, yeah.
Well, although post-abortion care might be different. I mean, we saw a lot of that in Ireland and in countries where abortion has been illegal, that you can still get post-abortion care. I mean, you tell women to go in and not say they took the pills and to say that they're miscarrying. I mean, I think, you know, Christine, you raise an excellent point, and especially as a physician, like, we do want every woman to have the gold standard of care. That's always been what the women's rights movement has been behind around reproductive health. But the reality is, well, we don't have that now, and we're having less of it. So there, I think part of the movement's role is to think of how can we safely, you know, allow women to have access, even if it's not legal. How do we support women? How do we support them, those who are targeted by our criminal justice system? I'm a lawyer. I like to do everything legally, but I think there are different roles for everybody in this. Women on Web is one organization that does provide a safe, it's a feminist-led organization by a doctor who's now in Canada, and they provide safe pills to women through the mail, and it's not legal, but it's supported and it's safe, and they've been providing medication in this country, and especially in Texas, well before the ban went into effect. And I think, you know, for better and for worse, that's where we are now. And so it's something to kind of wrap our brains around, as, you know, it's not legal, it's not illegal. What does that mean?
I mean, we call it self-managed abortion now. So yeah, that speaks to that. Yes, and I see another question. So I'll take that question from Judith in the audience.
I was just going to say briefly, I'm Christy's older friend. And that means that I remember, as Kathryn, very well before Roe versus Wade. And in fact, in 1969, I was just finishing up graduate school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I was asked by the board of Western Pennsylvania Hospital to do a study of 100 women who had had abortions in the hospital. And Kathryn, am I right? Was that the regulation was that you had, if you had two doctors, one being a psychiatrist, to say for psychological reasons you couldn't carry this pregnancy to term, you could then have an abortion.
Well,
And,
the law in Pennsylvania pre-Roe required that the abortion be necessary to protect a woman's life, and that's where the psychiatrist
they
came
would.
in.
But there were also several women in the study who had abortions illegally and then had complications and were admitted to the hospital for treatment. And I keep hoping someday I will find those interview notes. It was long before we had computers and things, because it was really, I mean, it was so moving what people went through. But even those who managed to have legal, if that's the right term, abortions in the hospital, what they went through and the trauma of it all, and what the complications of people who had illegal abortions. And I used to meet some of these people to interview them. Every one of the women in the study, except for two who had serious problems unrelated to their abortions, agreed to be interviewed because they felt it was so important that there be in the hospital continue doing these procedures at that time. But I mean, the stories about how people were able to get abortions were, you know, very moving, of course, as you all know.
Right. And I think the interesting part, Judith, of what you were talking about is that you in Pittsburgh and the women in Pittsburgh who had means or who had access to
Yes.
the psychiatrist or access to people in the hospital and who knew their way around the system,
Absolutely.
bypassed the problem. Others could go to New York. A lot of Pennsylvanians went to New York in 1970 and 71 and 72. But in my view, and I think it's really, really important to remember, once rights, one's ability to exercise important constitutional decision-making shouldn't depend on where you live.
No,
Okay.
no.
It's not fair that women in California should be permitted abortions, but women in Mississippi and in Texas can't get them. That's just fundamentally wrong. But until we have the political power to stop the bad laws in the bad states and implement a national law that protects all women in this country, we will be in that circumstance. And that's why I feel so strongly that we need to remind our friends and our family and our children and our mothers that it's time to get to work really, really hard as fast as possible in order to build that political power.
And Judith, I think you mentioned one other piece that is important. With the fact is that we are willingly allowing politicians to stigmatize women's basic decisions and access to health care. And so whether it was having a hospital psychiatrist or psychologist to, agree with your opinion decades ago, or whether it's now this waiting period that you have to go home and think about it, or you have to go through all these different hoops, that's not something that's acceptable. I mean, we named this book Controlling Women because we feel like a lot of these laws are meant to control these basic decisions and to really, cast judgment on them in a way, and to enforce this idea that your natural role as a woman is childbirth and childbearing. And for a lot of women, it's a great choice. I mean, I have moments of absolute joy with my children, but that's not all there is to it. And that nobody should be making those presumptions and those decisions and controlling other people's lives. And so we have a long way to go to get to that, unfettered access and support, and really having women have the support to make those decisions about whether they can afford to have a child and why can't they? Why don't we have government funded childcare in this country? Why don't we have parental leave? There's so many social supports and services that need to come along, regardless of the access to abortion, but that affect this decision. And I saw in the question that somebody asked about Texas and how it works that individuals can sue people. And, exactly. I think it's an unusual kind of law that the anti-abortion movement came up with in response to the kind of work that the Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood and the ACLU and others have been doing to protect abortion rights. We refer to it in the book as whack-a-mole, that these laws keep popping up in states, and these organizations are really just well-trained and well-equipped to bring laws and to bring lawsuits and to try to stop them. And so the sort of legal jiu-jitsu that came out of Texas of this law that couldn't be stopped, or it could have been stopped by the U.S. Supreme Court, but wasn't. And so that procedural piece, I think, is really distressing and really shows how far this court, the Supreme Court, is willing to go.
So, Christine, the first question most people ask me, and this is for the last, certainly the last 2 years, but well before that, is they're not really going to do this, are they? I mean, how could this happen, that they could take away a fundamental constitutional right? And I have to say to all of you, the most important thing is to realize that they can do this. There are 5 votes. What we talk about as a constitutional right will no longer exist. And I think it's really important to get over the hurdle. And I think the drama of Texas helped people see the writing on the wall. But too many of people on our side don't believe it. So one of the things I need all of you to do is to talk this up, to help your friends understand. Give them a copy of the book. Send it to your daughters, send it to your mothers, because again, it's important to understand that our worst nightmare is coming true, and we need to take action to prevent it being worse in the future.
And we can. I mean, we're optimists about this. And I think it's somebody said in the chat about how do we change men's minds. I mean, we have to create wider allies, and we need to really look at the models of movements that have worked very well. The Black Lives Matter movement, the marriage equality movement. They started and built alliances and had specific policy asks, and it's our turn now to start doing those same kinds of tactics. And Kitty and I are always like, just doesn't have to be the same thing for everybody doing all the same thing, but do something. And you all obviously are and are primed for it because you're here and listening. And I think that's the first step towards taking action.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for saying that, Julie. And I'm looking at the time. I think that was probably our last question. But I'll just end by saying what a thrill it was to read this
Before
book.
you do, I think we might have time to, sorry for interrupting, to answer the last one from Sabina. Do you mind if I read it, Christine? Or...
Oh, no, please. Sorry, I thought we had, I'm sorry. Yeah, please read it.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll let you say your goodbyes, and then I'll have a few after that. Sometimes when talking about women's rights, we hear that it's important to change men's minds. This is Sabina asking this question, and get men more involved in activism and advocacy. Should we be targeting men's attitudes in our activism and trying to convince them that this is not just a women's issue? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. All people ought to get involved because, as we say, this is, this affects families of all sorts, and men are certainly integral to many families in this country, not all, but certainly many. And non-binary people and trans people do have babies. And so it's not just a women's issue, but that hasn't stopped American politicians to try to relegate this question to people that they think have less political power. And in fact, the reason it's often portrayed as a women's issue and exclusively a women's issue is to stigmatize it, to make sure that they think that it's just only some people think this is important. So yes, it's important for men to be involved, and yes, it's important to take on the misogyny that's at the heart of this question. And one of the ways to do that is to have allies in every shape and form. Frankly, just, I'd be thrilled if more and more women got active and brought their families along in doing so.
And look, I mean, gender stereotypes hurt everybody. I mean, the gender stereotypes behind controlling access to sexual and reproductive health and rights harm men as well. It's a binary standard. It's old-fashioned in many ways. And so I was pleased to see a lot of men and joining and allies joining in the march in New York City. It was something I hadn't seen as much of before. So welcoming everyone. And I think, really looking at our partners in the racial justice movement and immigrant rights as well, because there's a lot of overlapping concerns about whose rights are being trampled how. So I think we do need to broaden our movement, generally speaking.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm glad we got to address that question. That felt like a really important one, so thanks. Okay, I'll end then by saying what a thrill it was to read this book and how much I learned and how fired up I was by the end. I know we've hit on some, some pessimistic feelings in this moment, and those are important. And also I felt a lot of hope, albeit maybe long-term, long view hope from this book. And yeah, I imagine as advocates, the two of you get a lot of thanks for the work that you do. But I also want to acknowledge what hard work it is and what a commitment to write a book like this for a wide audience. And it's really an amazing book. And I want to thank you for giving it to us and to the audience. Yes, that I can't recommend it enough. As you know, I can't recommend enough that you get it at Bookmine here in Napa or anywhere else. And yeah, share it widely because it's an important one.
Well, thank you. And we do want to thank Bookmine as well for continuing to keep people reading and learning and thinking and talking together. And Christine, you are walking the walk of a practicing physician, an advocate, a writer, and a caregiver of small ones. So we appreciate your taking the time to talk with us too.
And I want to just thank all of you for coming tonight. I urge you more than anything to get active. Doesn't matter what you do. You could be helping individual women obtain services. You can be, giving your financial resources to support the cause. You can get active in your local Planned Parenthoods or organizations that need your help, or get politically active to elect more state and federal office holders who support our cause as well. So thank you so much for your participation.
And thank you all. It's really been a wake-up call tonight to hear you say we have to give up on the Supreme Court. It's a bitter pill, but a necessary one. I think getting politically active is the answer, and shoring up the states that need our help and welcoming the women who need our help here as well. Thank you all for being here tonight. I really extend a thank you from Bookmine. Invite you all to check out the author event page and join us again in the near future. And I appreciate the hard work you're doing to bring this to our attention. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.
Night.
Thank you.
All right.